there is a popular theory of revolutions that says there is a crisis, a period of confusion or chaos, and then an opportunity presents itself where the current elite, the current power structure is caught by surprise, they're caught off guard, and somehow the revolutionaries are able to seize the opportunity and to create change. Could be a peaceful revolution, could be a violent revolution. This is a very popular theory of revolutions. It only works if the current power structure is identifiable. So let's say you have a king, let's say you have a monarchy, and there's a war, or there's a famine, or there's political repression, or there's slavery. There's some kind of very identifiable, formal relationship between the power structure and the crisis itself. So if there is a war, if there is a famine, if there is enslavement, then all of the popular emotion, all of the popular feeling is going to be against the king. Now, maybe it's not a king. Maybe it's a military dictatorship. Maybe it's the rule of a church or a theocratic organization. Maybe it's not necessarily a single king, but it's an aristocracy. It's a landed class, like the Normans and the Anglo-Saxons, or the Brahmin and the rest of Indian society. As long as there's some kind of identifiable ruling class with identifiable markings and characteristics and identifiable, identity, then a crisis can be an opportunity for that ruling class to be held to account, to be held responsible for grievances to be brought forth in a violent or non-violent way. And we see this with the Russian Revolution as being probably the most popular revolution that people think of when they just think of any sort of revolution. You had a king, you had a czar, and that monarch was blamed and he was scapegoated for all the problems of Russia. Now, he individually didn't make all of the decisions. He individually was not responsible for everything that went wrong. But he did initiate war with, at that time, I believe it was the Triple Alliance, which then became, I'm not even sure what the alliance was called, but the alliance between Germany and Austria-Hungary. He decided to intervene on the side of Serbia. That was his call, his choice, his pan-Slavic Orthodox choice. And he got involved with that war, and it was a disastrous war. It was a war that Russia wasn't prepared for. It was a war that Russia wasn't equipped to fight. And it was a war that ultimately Russia lost, even though its opponents, Germany and Austria-Hungary, would later lose to the Western powers. Russia ultimately lost that war. And because the king was this identifiable, formal figure, the buck stopped with him. He was the leader of the country. What could happen is social democrats, communists, Marxists, Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, anarchists, people of all stripes could point at the king or the czar, and they could say, he's responsible. And all the problems we have are to do with him, and if we just remove him, then we can usher in maybe a constitutional monarchy, maybe a social democracy, maybe a Bolshevik state, maybe Soviet councils, like a decentralized anarcho-syndicalist model, whatever. We can replace this very bad thing with an alternative. Okay, this has become insufferable. We need to try something else. So in that situation, all of those dissenting voices can bind together in one voice saying, down with the king, down with the czar. They can remove him from power, and then there's a chaotic aftermath of who is going to fill that power vacuum. Now, historically, the Bolsheviks eventually came along, and they filled that power vacuum, but it could have been someone else, right? Didn't have to be the Bolsheviks. It could have been someone else, but in our timeline, it was the Bolsheviks. So now we have to update to the modern day. There really aren't any more powerful monarchies in Europe. And so if we're speaking from like a European point of view or a Western point of view, and we say, okay, well, Britain has become intolerable. America has become intolerable. Germany has become intolerable. Whatever. The proposition that a crisis is going to come along. A war, a famine, a recession, a depression, social unrest, violence in the streets, gang warfare, ethnic warfare, whatever. The idea that a crisis will precipitate a change in government, and that this is an opportunity that people can seize. This formulation, or this cause and effect, it doesn't really translate as well from the situation of a monarchy to a democracy. And I think we see this with Donald Trump. We see this where people were caught up in the MAGA revolution. They were caught up in the Brexit revolution. They were caught up in the idea that they could have peaceful political change through democracy. And the interesting thing is that the fallout of the fact that, Donald Trump got into power, and it seems like the number of border crossings have increased. It seems like, the child separations that were being done quietly under Obama now that policy had to change under Trump because of the media pressure. It seems like there is a greater and greater need on the part of upper-class whites to signal about how much they love immigration, whereas previously it wasn't such a partisan issue. I mean, you can see Chuck Schumer, not too long ago, less than 10 or 20 years ago, or Bill Clinton talking about the need for a border wall or a border security or to limit illegal immigration, or the fact that illegals coming into the country is going to hurt the wages of the lower class, etc., etc. So it wasn't such a partisan issue just 10 or 20 years ago. Now it's extremely partisan to the point where it's not just a political issue. It's not just a policy opinion, but it is a religious and moral duty that you have to be in favor of unlimited immigration into the United States, or you are Satan, you are Hitler, you are the worst person ever. So Donald Trump, if you want to talk about accelerationism, Donald Trump in a sense has accelerated the social need to be a fanatic religious zealot about open borders. If you're an upper class white person, you have to be a fanatic religious zealot. And it's also accelerated this perception among everyone else, and by everyone else I mean all the other members of the upper class who are not white. It's accelerated this perception that there is a white lower class, a group of rednecks or Christian fundamentalists or whatever, white trash, that these people are just seething and frothing, and they're this angry, violent mass that want to deport you, that want to kick you out of the country, that are really scary. And it's, in terms of accelerationism, Donald Trump has accelerated this fear coming from a non-white elite that there are these white people out there who are organized and they're angry and they don't like immigrants, and I'm an immigrant or I'm a recent immigrant, and this thought process is going through their head, and so they're getting even more fanatical and fearful and hateful in response in terms of devising solutions of how can we suppress this class of low-income or middle-income white people. So that's what Donald Trump has done. He has had very little to do with slowing or decreasing the number of border crossings. It seems he's just increased the number. And unlike Obama could just put kids in cages and no one cared. But if Trump does it, it's somehow a human rights issue. And therefore, because Trump, whether he's unwilling or unable, whatever, all this media pressure comes down on him, all this judicial pressure comes down on him, and he, as a result, has to just catch and release. That is the policy, catch and release. So he might put out some numbers saying, oh, we caught 50,000 illegal immigrants just this month or just this year or something. He might put out incredible statistics about how many illegal border jumpers ICE has captured or arrested or held in detention, whatever. But the subsequent fact there of how many have been released, that's not really disclosed by Trump, because those numbers are very bad. And we can look at the similar thing like Brexit. I mean, the whole European Union issue is one big issue that is then discussed from a variety of perspectives in different countries. So with Britain, they'll say like, oh, the issue of and let me anyway, to get back to the larger point, it was just to say that people are mad about the European Union. They're mad about illegal immigration. They're mad about legal immigration. And they think that exiting the European Union is going to fix the problem, which isn't the same thing as the Schengen zone. But even if you exit the Schengen zone, it's not going to solve the problem. Problems are a little more fundamental. And when we talk about something like capitalism or democracy or the European Union or the United Nations, what we have to understand is that these organizations are multi-layered, multi-tiered, multifaceted, and they actually have a huge amount of redundancy. So, the European Union has a huge amount of redundancy in terms of trade agreements, freedom of movement, whatever, built into it, that you have to get to this point. They call it like you have to be a certain developed nation. When you look at the standards of who can join the European Union, they developed the standards of saying, okay, you need to have all of these functions in place in your government, in your financial sector. You need to have all this set up, so by the time you're ready to join the European Union, you've basically already joined in everything except name. And so then once you've already joined in terms of the substantial changes in your governance and your financial system, then they codify that by saying you're part of the European Union. So leaving the European Union actually doesn't change the fundamental political situation. I don't know. There is a king in Britain, or a queen, I don't care, but there is some kind of monarch over there. And, that monarch could die, and all of the monarchs could die, right? And the whole line could be discontinued. Would that really change the day-to-day political reality in Britain? Not really, because those actors don't really play a part in laying the groundwork of fundamental political forces. They're actually just keeping up. I mean, what was Meghan Markle? That whole marriage, marrying a woman who was divorced, marrying a woman who is an actor, marrying a woman who was an actress who portrayed, oral sex in a car on television, marrying a woman who was divorced, again, an American, someone of mixed race. You have all these qualifiers that make her a progressive wife for a royal family. So that's clearly a political move there. I mean, I don't know, it doesn't look that arbitrary if you look at the guy's dating history. He's just dating a bunch of white women from the upper class in Britain, and then all of a sudden this random lady comes out of nowhere who's an older woman. That's another thing, an older woman. So there's all these very strange things about her that make it I guess the only thing that could make it better if she was somehow like a female to male transgender man, and it was like a gay marriage, but she was pregnant because she still had ovaries because she was born a biological female. I mean, I suppose you could take it farther, but they've already taken it pretty far. And you can see that as social signaling. That's not something that necessarily, when you think of the royal British bloodline or the power of the British monarchy, that's not really something that you would think would naturally develop there. But these social currents that are produced by the media have very little to do with the British monarchy. Social currents are not controlled by a president who enters into office for 4 to 8 years. So when we're talking about a democratic system, we're talking about an illusion of power. Trump is put in to give the illusion of change. But, we don't elect the CEO of Goldman Sachs. We don't elect, James Comey or Robert Mueller. We don't elect these people. These are unelected officials. And furthermore, these people are beholden to other interests, to higher financial interests. I mean, Goldman Sachs has shareholders, so the CEO isn't completely independent. He's beholden to the shareholders. People like Comey and Mueller are beholden to those who put them in power. So there's a power structure which is not elected, and yet people popularly conceive of our government as a democracy. We could go further with capitalism. We could say capitalism is theoretically a system of competition, and yet in practice, it's a system of monopoly power. Facebook is a monopoly power. Google is a monopoly power. Apple is a monopoly power. Who else can we think of who's a monopoly power? I mean, this is what you see. Walmart is basically a monopoly power. These are huge monopolies that don't really face a lot of competition, that have incestuous ties with the government contracts, regulation, barriers to entry. I mean, that's all libertarianism 101, but, capitalism is a sham, and this illusion is being used to impose censorship, right? So conservatives, libertarians will defend Facebook, they'll defend Google, and they'll say, well, if you don't like Facebook and Google, then you should just build an alternative platform. Well, that would be like if you turn on your phone one day and it says, sorry, your conversation was inappropriate, and so we've banned you from having a phone number, and you say, okay, well, I'll just use an alternative service. But the government has granted, monopoly power to the telephone lines. There is no alternative service. And so you simply just can't communicate. Your freedom of speech has been removed, but it's been done under the guise of free market capitalism, and therefore you have this whole host of Washington, D.C. conservatives and libertarians who come out and they defend that censorship as being part of the free market. So all of these things that I'm talking about are democratic form of governance, are capitalist form of economics. These exist to provide buffer levels between the popular conception of power and the actual way that power is governed and the actual way that power is negotiated. So people think that they can just campaign for Donald Trump and vote for Donald Trump, or campaign for Brexit or vote for Brexit. They think they can support Viktor Orban or whoever, and they think that this is going to produce a fundamental change in the direction of their society. But really that these figures, or these, like a concept like Brexit, is really put out there to satiate the populace. It has really two purposes. First of all, to satiate the populace, to give them a false sense of victory. And then as that victory sours, it's to demoralize them and to make them feel like, well, I guess there's no recourse. I guess there's no way to have a democratic change. I guess there's no solution. I guess we should just accept it and move on with our lives. So this two-tiered system where you sort of have the populace they're unsatisfied, and then you have the actual form of governance, which is through monopoly, and it's through the intelligence services, and it's through corporatism, and it's through lobbying or whatever. You have that higher level, and then you have an in-between, which is democracy and capitalism. And democracy and capitalism acts as this buffer between the people who are governed and the people who are actually making decisions about governing. And so when we look at mass immigration, we see it as a way to further democratize the political environment. That is, you lower the standards of education, you lower intelligence of the average population, you increase low-level tensions between people on a street-to-street level, especially for the lower and middle class, who can't isolate themselves from low-level ethnic conflict, and you distract them with those sort of problems, and then they're sort of busy electing populist candidates, nationalist candidates, trying to solve these problems at a fundamental level without realizing that, all of this, it's the democratic system itself. The concept of power to the people is what has led to the situation that you have a government voting to replace the people of a country. Look at a country like East Germany or any country in the communist bloc. They were communists, and Jews even were influential in some of these communist countries. So if you want to say, well, Jewish communists are trying to replace white people, well, why didn't Jewish communists try to replace white people in communist countries, in communist East Germany, in communist Poland, in communist Russia? If you think about it, there were more demographic inhibitors in communist Russia than there are today in the Federated Republics of Russia. In communist times, you had to have a passport to travel from the Caucasus, that is from the Caucasus Mountains, from the south of Russia with Dagestan, places like that with a high Muslim population. You had to have a passport and government approval to travel from there to Moscow. You had to have a passport to travel from there to St. Petersburg. You had to have a passport to travel from there to Stalingrad, now Volgograd. And all of that's sort of been done away with. And now there's this freedom of movement, or expanded freedom of movement. And so you have a lot of people, Muslims from the Caucasus, moving up into Moscow, Volgograd, St. Petersburg. And there is a demographic shift that's going on because the white birth rate has collapsed in post-communist Russia. So again, you have to wonder if communists and Jews, they just want to replace white people, why didn't they do it in communist Russia, communist Poland, East Germany? Why didn't they do it in these countries? Or any Romania, Belarus, Ukraine? If they hate white people so much, why weren't they replacing them? Why were the birth rates higher under communism than they are now? Because there weren't these democratic incentives to dumb down the population. The incentive was to make the population as educated as possible, as industrious as possible, as satisfied as possible, so that it would do the work of communism, so that it would build the power of the communist empire, so that the communist empire could then expand and take over the world. That was the theory. There was no reason to invite Muslims into East Germany. There was no reason to invite Muslims into the north of Russia. There was no reason to invite Muslims into Poland or any other demographic group that's not part of the majority of these countries. There was no reason to demographically replace these populations because voting was not an issue. And the illusion of democracy and the idea of the legitimacy of democracy was not really an issue. There weren't really elections, or if there were elections, it was, okay, you have Communist A and Communist B. And so there was no need to do this. Now that we have this concept that the ultimate legitimacy of a government comes from whether a majority of the population voted for the government or not. And so in that case, if you can just point and you say, well, we swamped your country with Mexicans, we swamped your country with Muslims, they voted for the government, therefore it's a legitimate government. What do you have to complain with? Don't attack us. Attack each other. Attack the Muslims, attack the Mexicans. In a situation in which there is no democracy, there is no incentive for any of these governing parties or governing interests to invite in mass immigration. It just causes, it essentially is a tax on the common person to have uneducated, unskilled laborers flowing into the country. The reason why they're flowing in is because they're taking advantage of social services, whether that's we have great roads, we have great police services, we have great, and they're not perfect, obviously, but they're better than the systems where those people are originating from, Mexico, the Middle East, Africa, Asia. All of these social systems have been constructed over generations and generations. And a lot of social capital, a lot of wealth has gone into constructing those systems and maintaining those systems and reducing corruption. And now you're having people move into neighborhoods where the neighborhoods are safer, everything works more effectively, the economy works better because you have all this infrastructure built up, whether it's the roads, the hospitals, the school, whatever. So even if they're not directly taking welfare, they're taking advantage of all this free stuff, and they're only contributing unskilled labor. Now, in light of automation, no one really needs unskilled labor in 20, 30, 40 years. Unskilled labor is still useful today, but if you were thinking in terms of the long term, like, hey, how do we want to set up this country for success in 20, 30, 40 years, you would not be importing millions of unskilled laborers into your country. It just doesn't make sense. Maybe in the next 10 years it's still relevant. Maybe you need people to lay the bricks and lay the mortar or whatever. But with increasing automation, all of these people are going to be unemployable. They are not teachable. There's a point at which, even if you assume infinite plasticity of the mind at birth, this plasticity wears out. By the time someone's 20, 30, 40 years old, the plasticity of their brain to learn to code wears out. Now, I don't even believe that people are infinitely plastic. I think people's brains have certain predispositions and certain potentialities at birth. It doesn't mean that they're born being able to do calculus. Of course, you still need to teach them. But I think different people have different potentialities. But even if we assumed that everyone was born equal, still, here's a laborer, a day laborer who's been living for 20, 30 years in Mexico. They have construction skills, they have masonry skills, they have whatever kind of skills. Manual labor, they come to America, they work for the next 5, 10 years, but their labor is going to become obsolete. Furthermore, the shelf life of these people, and I'm sorry to put it in those terms, but we're looking at a capitalist economy where craftsmanship and artisanry are not really valued. And so these people really are treated as indentured servants. They are treated as slaves. They are treated as sharecroppers in a way. And they're looked at economic units rather than as humans. And that's why they're being brought in, not because of touchy-feely empathy, but because of cold economic calculation of, okay, well, they're going to be able to do useful work for the next 20, 30 years at dirt cheap wages. But by the time you're 50 years old, 60 years old, you can no longer invest those skills into the economy. You no longer have the physical capability to work as a 20, 30-year-old man. So there is an expiration date on this. And when that expiration date hits us, you're essentially going to have tens of millions of unemployable, low-skilled workers who are going to be taking out retirement money. They're going to be on, Medicare or Medicaid? I always forget which. But they're going to be receiving free health care, free housing. Everything is going to be given to them from the government. They never invested a lot in the beginning because it's not like they were creating businesses. It's not like they were computer programmers. They were simply doing, and even the ones who are computer programmers, the H-1Bs, they're doing the bare minimum. They're doing like high school kid levels of coding. And at some point, these people, they're going to be taking much more out of the economy than they're putting in. So from a long-term standpoint, you'd think, oh, well, this is going to cause some huge economic collapse. This is going to cause some problems. It remains to be seen what's going to happen when the majority of Western countries are elderly people we're going to develop new technology to prolong people's lives, and it's going to be 10 times more expensive than current healthcare. We're going to develop like robot doctors for $1 million a pop, and every single old person is going to be granted a robot doctor. I mean, either that's going to happen, or at some point someone's going to say, no, we're just going to start euthanizing old people. I mean, it's going to go either way. At some point, it has to become ridiculous. At some point, it has to go beyond what we can currently imagine, because the trends just aren't sustainable. Either the entire economy, like the military just shuts down, and all of the funding that went toward the military now goes towards servicing 90-year-olds, or alternatively, we just start euthanizing 90-year-olds. And those two trends, they're kind of competing with each other at this point. You don't know which one is going to win out. Like, is this intense materialist fear of death that we have, is that going to just consume everything else in our society? Or is our nihilism and suicidalism, is that going to overcome the materialist fear of death, and we're just going to start, mass genociding old people? I don't know what's going to happen. But, the reason I bring up these issues, and people can call it cynical, but my perspective is that these revolutionaries, they have delusions of grandeur. And delusions of grandeur are very attractive because they make you feel powerful, they make you feel relevant, they bring excitement to a life that might otherwise be boring or mundane or uninteresting. I mean, if you really reflect on what your life is, you look at your job, you look at your education, wherever you are, whatever age you are, you kind of project your life out of what you're capable of, and that's sort of a reflection of who your parents are and what your family is and your social network. And you sort of look around at the people you hang out with and you say, well, we're not very important people. We're probably not going to be in the history books when we die. And for people who obsess and deify historical figures, people like Churchill, or people like FDR, people like JFK, whoever you, and it could be people who are very different but of a sort of similar stature. If you fetishize these people, you idolize these people, if you worship these people in a way and you look up to them and you want to be them, then you yourself become this huge disappointment. And you have two choices at that point. You can either put away these people from your mind and you can try to worship like Jesus, or a god of self-improvement, or a god of self-satisfaction, or you can try to enter into a religion where achievement is not really an important thing. And it's not really how much you achieve, but it's like how much you achieve relative to your potentiality, rather than it's more of an inward perspective as opposed to a world historical perspective. So you can do that, or you can make up a lie, a very complicated, intelligent lie about how a crisis is coming, and you're going to seize control of that crisis, and then you're going to become part of like a new ruling class in an ethno-state or something like this. So people make up these very complicated fantasies, not just individually, but as a group. They form these political groups, and they make up these very complicated political fantasies to make themselves feel like they're part of something important, something world historical. So they've set up this fantasy, and then they're very disappointed when I come along and I tell them the reality, and they call me blackpilled, they call me cynical, they call me depressed. I'm not blackpilled or cynical or depressed because I accept reality, and I'm not trying to pursue a fantasy. It's a very similar phenomenon to incels. This is probably the most important point I'm going to make in the video. That an incel is not someone who can't get laid. I would challenge most of these self-described incels, young men who can't get laid. I would challenge them. Have you done every single thing possible to get laid? For instance, have you tried to sleep with an obese woman? Have you tried to hire a prostitute? Have you tried to, and we can go down the list of like things, and you go down the list and they'll say, well, I don't want to do that. I don't want to sleep with an obese woman. I don't want to sleep with a crazy woman. I don't want to sleep with a prostitute. I don't want to sleep. And really what it goes back to, their standards. Now, they're going to tell you that their standards are reasonable. But you do have to step back and you say, well, okay, you're a pretty mediocre person. You're a pretty flawed person. You're not an exceptional person. So what makes you think in a hypergamous society that you somehow deserve to sleep with a woman who checks all of these boxes of normalcy and health? Because, I mean, traditionally, if we're coming at this from a traditional perspective, traditionally, a man's virtue comes from his accomplishments. And so a man who goes off to battle and he wins the battle, he's a good man, he's a virtuous man. A man who, I'm trying to think, he makes a lot of money, he could be a good or virtuous man in a mercantile society. So a man is made into a good man, a virtuous man, a powerful man, a respectable man, a man that a woman wants to marry. He's made into an attractive man through his accomplishments. Whereas a woman is not so much about her accomplishments, a woman is just about her being, her health, her mental health, her appearance, whatever. It's not so much what she's done, but what she is. A man's identity is not defined by who he is, it's defined by what he has done. You can say, well, I'm a great man. Well, what makes you so great? What have you done? Whereas a woman can say, I'm a great woman. Oh, yeah, well, that's apparent because I can see that you look normal, you look healthy, and you act normal. And that's really all a woman needs to be a great woman, is just to be great. Be great sort of as a passive object, whereas a man is expected to be active, to be an accomplished maker, to be an achiever. So you can say, well, I haven't achieved much, but neither has this woman. Well, you're comparing apples to oranges. I think this is something that incels do, where they say, well, I'm a mediocre man, so I deserve a mediocre woman. But their standard of what a mediocre man to them is a man who's accomplished nothing in his life, or he has a job, or he has a house, or like some kind of middle class minimum. And a mediocre woman is like, she's got to be an 8 out of 10, she's got to have normal mental health, she's got to be skinny, right? So he's creating all these standards, and he's saying, well, within my range, none of the girls want to sleep with me. Well, maybe you need to lower your standards, because the definition of womanhood has changed, where women are now expected to be economic achievers. They're expected to excel in their career. And so if that has been added to the burden of women's responsibilities, then as a corollary, her priorities become less focused on her being, on her appearance, her skinniness, her mental health, her behavior, her femininity. So that's a cost that we have as a society from encouraging women to excel in the corporate world. Not just women working, because women have always worked. That's a very different thing entirely. But the idea that women should be managers, women should be excelling in the corporate world, well, there's a consequence to that. And yeah, so I would challenge the whole concept. The incel is someone who is, in my mind, there's very few people who are actually incels. There might be some horribly disfigured men who go to a prostitute, and even the prostitute says, I don't want your money. I don't want to touch you. You're horribly disfigured. But I think 9 out of 10 times or more, all of these incels are merely men whose standards are defined by pornography, and therefore, because they're not able to achieve sleeping with a porn actress in real life, then they decide to be an incel. A lot of things that people say, well, I've been forced into this position, when you really investigate, they've made a choice. They've made a choice. They have certain standards. They don't want to lower their standards, and so they're stuck with nothing. I think that's the psychology of incels, and that is the psychology to a great degree of people who want to be world historical agents, people who want to affect political change, is that they have this expectation, they have this standard of my theory of revolution must be true, or this has to happen. And when I try to point out that they're wrong, they just call me cynical, a blackpiller, depressed, whatever. They use some kind of prefabricated, and I guess Christians, they would say Jesus is coming back any moment now. The early Christians believed that Jesus was going to come back any moment. They believed that Emperor Nero was the Antichrist, and that Jesus was going to come back within the reign of Nero. So they would say, he's going to come back any moment now. And then, if someone came along and said, I don't think that's realistic, they would have been correct, but they would have been denounced as a heretic, they would have been denounced as an unbeliever, they would have been denounced as unfaithful, and they would say the only way that you can be a good Christian is if you truly believe that Jesus is coming back any time now. And this is a very similar psychology to the people who say, we just have to hope for some radical war or depression or recession or crisis to come along, and at that point, we're going to save the West, we're going to save Western civilization, we're going to have an ethno-state, whatever. We're going to have communism. I mean, this happens on the left wing, so it's not like the left wing is not guilty here. The left is just as guilty as the right, but this kind of political fetishism, the fantasies that go on, I feel like I'm going up to an incel and saying, hey, buddy, you're not going to sleep with a porn star. I'm sorry. You don't have the money to pay her, and you're not very attractive, and you're just not very appealing. You're kind of a mediocre underachiever. You're not going to sleep with a porn star, but there's a majority of women in America who are, maybe not your ideal type. Maybe they don't have a nice symmetrical face. Maybe they're a little on the obese side, whatever. You could sleep with those women, but if you don't want to, that's your choice. You're not an incel. You're voluntarily celibate. You're choosing not to have sex because the women that are attracted to you are not up to your standard. And so they've created a fantasy of how things must be, and if you try to explain that their fantasy is a fantasy, if you try to explain the reality of the situation, they say you're gaslighting, you're victim blaming, and it's a very similar psychology. So there's a lot of overlap in the two social phenomena that, and it goes beyond incel. I think it goes beyond incel to marriage, and that for me is the important thing, because I don't know, we talk about this incel thing, and I just don't really like to hang around these people so much. I don't know, if someone identified to me as an incel, I would say you probably have a problem, like so that wouldn't really. I feel that people are made up by the company that they keep, and I'm trying to improve myself. I'm not like in some perfect place, so I am trying to surround myself by people who I think are good influences, and so I just don't spend a lot of time around incels. So to me, the problem is not like, oh, we can't get laid, and I've never really viewed that as a mark of like, if someone says to me, oh, I'm so sexually frustrated I can't get laid, I'd be like, well, you have two problems. First of all, there's some flaw about you that you can't date women. Second of all, why do you view getting laid as this such an important thing? I mean, there's so many historical figures that were great, that were world historical, that were virgins till quite late in their life. I mean, people like Goethe, I think Kant, people who kept their celibacy, kept their virginity voluntarily. I think there's something virtuous there. I think there's something powerful there. Nietzsche talks about the power of abstaining from sex so that you can take those sexual energies and divert them elsewhere and change society. So I think there's something to that. So I don't have a lot of sympathy for those people necessarily, because I viewed it as like, either, I mean, if you're sexually frustrated, that must mean you're either not trying, or you're lying to yourself, or you just don't recognize that celibacy is actually a good thing, or a potentially good thing. So I'm not really. I don't really think that's a fundamental problem. I think the more fundamental problem is the problem of marriage, of stable relationships, that people cannot form stable relationships. That's a tougher nut to crack, because every relationship has three people: the man, the woman, and society. And if society is telling women especially that if you don't like your relationship, it's like a pair of jeans, you just get a new one, then there's going to be this constant hypergamy, and no marriage will be able to last. I mean, of course, some do, but at this point, it's the minority of marriages that actually last. The majority of marriages end in failure. So I think, to me, that's the bigger problem than just like, to me that always seemed infantile and immature, the concept of like, oh, well, we're incels, we can't get laid. To me, the more important thing is like, you can't start a family, or you can't invest in a woman, or you can't have children with a woman because you're always afraid she's going to steal half your income and steal your children and ruin your life. I mean, that to me seems pretty significant. I don't know, some of these people who are like talking about the incel problem and then talking also about traditionalism, it's like, don't you realize that in a traditional society, theoretically, men are supposed to be celibate? Like, when Tacitus wrote about the Germans, he said the Germans maintain celibacy, and they consider any man who has sex before, I think it's age 21, or some, like late adulthood, essentially, or early adulthood, depending on how you look at it. But he said until they reach adulthood, they're considered weak if they give in to sexual urges. They're supposed to maintain their celibacy. So in a traditional society, pre-Christian pagan societies, you would still have to be involuntarily celibate. But the payoff was that then you could enter into a marriage, and that was a stable institution. That's been taken away, and so as a result, people aren't having children, which is, from an evolutionary perspective, that's the worst place you can put a majority. The majority of people are instinctually structured to want to have kids, and if you take that possibility away from them, there's going to be huge consequence to that. So to me, it's not really so much about getting laid, it's more about the social institution of marriage if we're destroying that. So I don't know what happens when these social trends get bad enough that they get worse. What happens? Well, there's a couple of different outcomes. One is that you get minority groups that are capable of forming subcultures that are effectively able to insulate themselves from wider society and to continue having a culture of stable marriages. So the Mormons, the Orthodox Jews, the Amish, various other minorities who have a traditional, maybe like Brahmin, Indians, whatever. Maybe Muslims, some fundamentalist Muslims are going to be able to insulate themselves from the wider Hollywood society and continue on. And so while everyone else is dying off and committing suicide and overdosing on opiates, these minoritarian communities will survive, and eventually the majority of society is going to be made up of these communities and everyone else is going to die out. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is this is going to create so much social unrest that there's a revolution. But again, the problem comes back to if there's a revolution within a democratic capitalist context, then all that means is Donald Trump goes out, Bernie Sanders comes in. Bernie Sanders goes out, Tucker Carlson comes in. Tucker Carlson goes out, Kamala Harris comes in. Kamala Harris goes out. And this goes back and forth and back and forth. And really the underlying structures of society, the social direction of Hollywood has never changed. Because we've maintained the illusion of capital democracy. We've maintained the illusion of freedom of choice and the free market, and so you can't attack something that can't be identified. If we can't just say like, okay, so there's some kind of permanent structure to our financial system, there's a persistent structure to our financial there's a permanent structure to our financial system. People can't identify. If I ask you who's the richest person in the world, someone would say, oh, maybe it's George Soros, maybe it's Bill Gates, maybe you might be able to come up with a few names. Rupert Murdoch, you might be able to come up with a few names. Most people, they are more entertained, they're more focused on the supposed policymakers, people like Donald Trump, people like Obama. They're focused on these people. They're focused on essentially what is a circus clown show. It's a distraction away from the real reins of power, and they're focused, and they're so hateful. I mean, ask liberals. Say, who's the person who you think is destroying the country right now? Oh, it's Donald Trump. If you ask conservative, who's destroying the country right now? Oh, the media might be an answer. Well, who controls the media? I don't know. Again, they might be able to name a few key figures, but ultimately they can't really identify the structure. They wouldn't know how to attack it. They wouldn't even know how to proceed. And okay, what's the solution? If the media is the problem, then what do we do? Oh, elect Donald Trump for a second term. That'll solve the problem. No, there really is no solution to the problem. Because these people have been brainwashed by the illusion of democracy and capitalism to believe like, oh, if you don't like Rupert Murdoch, you can just change the channel. If you don't like Mark Zuckerberg, you can just go to a different social media platform. They've been brainwashed with this propaganda, with the illusion of freedom of choice, and so they wouldn't be able to come up with a solution. Most people, the majority of people, are not going to be able to say like, oh, well, maybe we should bring Mark Zuckerberg to trial. Maybe we should bring all these people to trial. Maybe we should have just total government control over media. Because then they say, oh, that's scary. But what if, if the government controls media, this is something conservatives will say. They'll say, if the government controls media, we're going to lose our freedom of speech. They'll make these really on surface level, superficial arguments that on the surface, I guess it makes sense. If you assume we have a free market, if you assume we have freedom of choice, then I guess, yeah, technically government takeover would destroy the freedom of speech. But that's not what we have. We don't have a free market. We don't have freedom of choice. And so a government takeover of media would theoretically allow for more freedom of speech, because then decentralized actors could have their own platforms. If YouTube and Google didn't own this platform I'm speaking on right now, if the government owned this platform, then I could go buck wild on a YouTube channel. I could host whoever I wanted. I could promote whatever I wanted. I could say whatever I wanted. And the channel could not be taken down because it would be inscribed in law as a public space. And I have freedom of speech to say whatever I want, so long as I'm not being violent or threatening people with violence specifically or making credible threats. I could pretty much say and do whatever I want. That's not the situation. So, yeah, I mean, there theoretically would be a lot more freedom under government control of these social media platforms. That's not going to happen. And it's really sad. It's almost laughable the way that this campaign, like conservatives are being censored on social media. What are we going to do? there are no solutions. There are no solutions because people can't even conceive of coming up with a solution, because that would contradict, or it would expose the contradiction of democracy and capitalism as a sham. Yeah, I mean, I think formalism is useful as a way to divorce yourself of political fantasies. Because if you're engaged in political fantasies, that has a real destructive impact on your life. What people do when they engage with political fantasies, they ruin their life to support Donald Trump. They ruin their life to support Brexit. They ruin their life to support this or that. They sacrifice their job, their career, their marriage, their children. They sacrifice everything to support a political fantasy, and nothing happens as a result. I think that's sad. So I want to divorce people from political fantasies. That's why I do political analysis. That's why I talk about politics. I don't talk about it with the hope that I'm going to make a change, or that anyone else is going to make a change, because I think democracy and capitalism have hacked into the fundamental nature of human beings. That this is, in the same way that a Diet Coke is engineered to make you fat, like democracy and capitalism are engineered to make you complacent. You know, people drink Diet Coke. I see obese people drinking Diet Coke. I drink my Diet Coke. I made the switch, because I'm trying to lose some weight. And they don't care that Diet Coke's going to make you just as fat, if not fatter. Then, because what makes people fat is not sugar. Sure, I mean, you could inject sugar into someone's bloodstream, but if that sugar was in a capsule, it wouldn't matter, because, I mean, you wouldn't want to inject a capsule into someone's bloodstream. But look, the point here is that it's not the sugar itself that makes people fat. It's when your body interprets, oh, we've got sugar. What do? We take some insulin, and to simplify the model for you, I'm just going to say you combine the sugar with the insulin, and that produces fat. So it's really the insulin production that results in the buildup or increase of fat cells. And so if you've got a Diet Coke, and the chemicals in the Diet Coke are interpreted by the body as sugar, even if they're not real sugar, even if they have no calories, 0 calories, whatever, there's no calories in these chemicals, but they taste like sugar and they're interpreted by the mind as sugar, your body's still going to produce insulin in response. It's still going to increase fat cell production. But people don't care. They just keep drinking their Diet Coke, and they keep voting for Trump, and they keep, believing that we got to defend capitalism from socialism. Capitalism is under threat from Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar and Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. The Democrats are trying to bring Bernie Sanders socialism to America. We have to stop them. Implying that we have freedom of choice. We don't have a great degree of freedom of choice. In our consumer choices, most of what we have is we can buy from monopolies. When we go out to buy a computer, we're buying a PC or a Mac 90% of the time. Yeah, sure, there are other models. There are other companies. There are Chinese companies out there. There's other companies besides Microsoft and Apple, but they have a lower market share. So, if you're making if you're trying to get the most bang for your buck, you're going to be feeding into a monopoly like Walmart, like Apple, like Facebook, like Google, whatever. If you're just trying to make the best choice for you as an individual, you will feed inevitably into this system of monopolies that disguises itself as capitalism. I'm not projecting some kind of change to this system, except to say that we're going to, if either genetic engineering is successful or nanotechnology is successful, we're going to continue to augment our human intelligence and or develop some kind of robotic artificial intelligence. And that sort of intelligence is going to negate the necessity of having a democratic capitalist system that constantly fools the masses and subverts their own will against them. Because these thinking machines or these augmented humans aren't going to be fooled by a ruse like democracy or capitalism. They're going to be able to see past that quite easily, and therefore it's no longer going to be a useful lie, and it's just going to collapse. So I do think there is something that comes after capitalism and democracy, and that is some form of phenotypic revolution. But otherwise, unless we're talking about a change in technology, I don't project that social trends will change. I think they're going to continue accelerating, and there's not going to be some crisis event that destroys the system. If anything, a crisis event is going to be utilized by the system to reinforce itself. And we're going to have some kind of United Nations, this is already happening, right? The United Nations global human rights transgender dictatorship. Currently, the problem that the right wing has with colonialism is the same problem that the left wing has. Really, if you live in America and you say, what do you think about colonizing other countries? What do you think about imperialism? They would reject it on the grounds that is a right-wing Nazi concept. We shouldn't do that. That's a white supremacist, white nationalist concept. It's a patriarchal concept. But what if I said, rather than imperialism or colonialism, what if I said, the United Nations is going to create a global council on human rights, and it's going to draw up a list of human rights, and under these are going to be gay rights, transgender rights, ethnic minority rights, religious minority rights. And it is going to create an army of the United Nations. And any time a single nation breaks one of these laws of the United Nations, that nation will be invaded, its military will be destroyed, and it will have human rights enforced upon itself. If you put it in that language, and maybe you soften the language some bit and you make it a little more bureaucratic, but if you suggest that to people, the right wing's going to say, no, that's global communism. But the left is going to be fine with it. So as the right wing continues to drift toward the left, as conservatives become more, this is just a constant thing we see throughout history since the 17th century, since what we might call, I would say the formative event there is probably the split between Catholicism and Protestantism. But anyway, since that time, we see this constant, and I've talked about it at length, the left-right divide throughout history. But as the right continues to slide toward the left is going to be more extreme. The left is going to be more friendly to this idea. They're going to be friendly to the idea of imperialism as long as it's done within the moral and religious framework of global, human, materialist, secular human rights. And so that eventually is going to manifest as an opportunity. So when there is a crisis, let's say it's a global recession, global depression, warfare, whatever. If you look at World War II, the governing bodies of America, the British Empire, whatever, essentially fused together. And they formed a global government, and they formed, government that was unitary to a great degree, with very little disagreement. And they drew up plans. This was the Anglo-American global government, drew up plans to make South America one government, Africa's one government, Europe's one government, Soviet Union's one government, China, I think, got its own government, America and Canada became its own government. So this was a plan that was drawn up, and that's kind of what we're headed toward. And there's not much you can do, but you do want to divorce yourself of fantasy. You don't want to be caught up in street marches. You don't want to be caught up in political campaigns. You don't want to be donating to Donald Trump in his re-election bid for 2020 or anyone else. You want to, and I'm not telling people think I'm saying disengage from politics. I understand politics is a fun hobby. Chess is a fun hobby. But don't ruin your life over chess. Don't sacrifice your relationships. Don't sacrifice friendships. Don't sacrifice your career over the game of chess. Unless you're so good at chess that you can become a grandmaster. And so in the case of the politics, it would be, if you can be a successful politician and make money off of that, go ahead. Go be a cynical sociopath in politics. You do you. But for normal people, everyday people, mediocre people, you can be interested in politics. You can engage with politics. You can discuss politics to the extent that it's a fun hobby in the same way that chess is a fun hobby, And we understand the evolutionary appeal. We want to feel powerful. We want to feel interested in the day-to-day of global affairs. But don't delude yourself into making great sacrifices in the name of political progress when you as an individual have no input whatsoever. There is a false buffer of democratic capitalism that creates an illusion of choice that doesn't really exist. It doesn't affect financial governance. It doesn't affect these, global unelected bodies. It doesn't affect the real underpinnings of power. And so when a crisis does come, it's not going to result in a national populist revolution. It's going to result in a transnational, transgender dictatorship that dominates the globe in the name of secular, atheist human rights. And again, the right-wing conservatives right now, that's communism. We'll never give up our guns. We're never going to give up our freedom of speech. They're going to give it up, just like they've given up all of the things of the past. They've given up their racism. They've given up their sexism. They've given up their fundamentalist Christianity. They've given up their anti-Semitism. They've given it all up. I mean, really, if you poll Americans, and you can look at the polls yourself, there is polling data that was taken in the 1940s in America, 1930s, 1940s. And they asked people questions with regard to Hitler. Because, of course, today we think of Hitler as the moral center of evil. And so whatever is associated with Hitler is more evil. Whatever is distant from Hitler is less evil. And so they asked basically a couple of questions. One of the first polls I've seen was, would you rather Hitler win the war and America remains segregated, racially segregated, or Hitler loses, we win, but America is forced to desegregate? A majority of Americans said, let Hitler win. So that's an important point. Second point is, Americans from 1939 to 1944 were polled. And remember, prior to 1939, there was a degree of freedom of speech. You had people like Father Coughlin talking about the Jews and being anti-Semitic openly. So they asked people, okay, which group, select from this list, which group is most dangerous? And they would say, the Germans, the Japanese, the Italians, and then they also had the Jews. And they said, which group is the greatest threat to America at this time? And from 1939 to 1944, a plurality of Americans chose the Jews as the biggest threat to America. And that was because of the propagandizing of people like Father Coughlin, who was the most popular radio personality in the 30s. Then he was banned during the Second World War, but people didn't forget what he had to say. They just sort of shuffled and went along with the government because it became a dictatorship under FDR, had complete control over the media and everything else. So, with that being said, it wasn't until 1945 that Americans finally stopped saying in a plurality that the Jews are the greatest threat to America, and they started saying, it's the Russians, it's the communists. So they finally made that shift in 1945. But again, from 1939 to 1944, it was the Jews. And they would rather Hitler win than lose racial segregation. So we're talking about a population that changed dramatically, that went from being like, hey, just let Hitler win, but we need to keep segregated, to just 20 years later deciding to desegregate the country at the point of a gun. I mean, even Eisenhower in the 40s was desegregating. Or excuse me, not the 40s, the 50s. I think it was 1954, 1959. Eisenhower was sending National Guard in to desegregate at the point of a bayonet, sticking sharp knives at people and saying, no, you got to let black people in your school. So there was a huge shift that happened between 1939 and between 1954. I mean, huge shift. And, those kinds of shifts will continue to happen. There's no reason for them to stop. I mean, you can say, there's some kind of limit to this. Sure, you can just say that. But I'm not sure that there is. I think the limit traditionally was the fact that you had many different interests around the world. You had different clans, different tribes, different nation states. And so if one nation state went off the reservation and just started destroying its lower class and middle class, destroying the concept of gender, destroying the concept of religion, society would collapse, and then barbarians from the east or the south or wherever they were from, in the case of Scotland, maybe the Picts from the north, would come down, the barbarians would come down and attack Hadrian's Wall, or the Vikings from the north, whatever. Vikings from somewhere else would come in, and they would attack, and they would take over your civilization and reinstitute traditionalism. In this case, there are no barbarians at the gates who are going to reinstate traditionalism after some kind of societal collapse. You do have this global centralization that prevents that, and I think as a result, there's really no limit to the degeneration. The only limit is the number of people who are capable of committing suicide through drug overdose, through shooting themselves, through hanging themselves. Really, that is the only hard and fast limit. And once all the poor people and all the middle class people kill themselves, and there are only rich people left, then you will have a sustainable scenario, because they're going to be, fed and clothed and taken care of by robots, and eventually the robots will be smart enough they don't need the rich people anymore. So that's sort of the projected future. Is it dystopian? Is it 1984? Is it black-pilled? Is it depressing? I don't know, guys. If you go back to Christianity 2,000 years ago, they believed that the Antichrist was certain. It wasn't a guess. It wasn't a probability. It wasn't like maybe this will happen. But they said, our prophets, our holy book, the book of Revelation, says it is certain the Antichrist will come. He's going to institute a terrible rule upon the face of the earth. There's going to be a tribulation. There's going to be a terrible time in which up and down is up, and everything's reversed, and people are going to be raped in the streets, and there's going to be massive warfare, the likes of which you've never seen, massive plagues, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. So it's going to be terrible, but then after all that happens, there's going to be some good ending. And for people who are going to call me black-pilled, who are going to call me pessimistic, who are going to call me a negative Nancy, I hear you, but this perspective isn't new. This perspective is more than 2,000 years old. This perspective, and now, did the apocalypse actually come? Did Revelation actually come? Did hell on earth actually come? Well, you can judge that for yourself. Maybe we're living through the time of the Antichrist right now. The question is, do you care? Do you think that this is the end? Do you think that the reality that you're living in is the ultimate reality? And if we don't get this earth right, if we don't right this ship, then it's all for nothing and we should all just kill ourselves now? Or do you believe that reality is somehow deeper than your individual lifespan? Do you believe in reincarnation? Do you believe in life after death? Do you believe in heaven? Do you believe in parallel universes? Do you believe in some kind of deep theory of consciousness? Do you believe in a simulated reality? Do you believe that this life is just a test, like a karmic test, of your moral willpower to overcome the lusts of your flesh and to be dedicated toward moral goodness and purity and overcoming your inabilities and your shortcomings and the deck of cards that you were dealt? How do you view your reality? That's important. The distinction between a world historical thinker, someone who thinks we have to maintain the empire, we have to maintain Anglo-American supremacy. Or you have people who think, no, that's all an illusion, that's all nonsense, that's here today and gone tomorrow. What's really important is your eternal soul, and you need to get right with God, and you need to get right with yourself. I mean, you need to ask yourself, if nothing matters, if America's falling, if everything's on fire, at the end of the day, the only person I can control is myself. And am I doing the right thing? Am I treating people rightly? It's not even a question of being kind. Because treating people rightly isn't about being kind. If someone's killing themselves, the right response, if you see someone with a noose around their neck and they're standing on a chair and they're about to kick the chair from out under them, the right thing is not to give them a smile and a thumbs up and to say, great job. You're awesome. You're doing the right thing. I'm encouraging you. I'm proud of you. Clap, 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 clap. Being kind in that moment is not the right thing. Rushing over and doing something to get them out of that situation, and if you have to bruise them up or whatever to save them from doing that's not very nice. Like if I saw that situation, or someone's about to jump off a bridge, grabbing them, choke throwing them to the ground, doing some body slams, some WWE wrestling moves, some jiu-jitsu, whatever. You throw them to the ground. Sure, they're going to be bruised. They're going to be beat up. They're not going to be happy. It's not the kind thing to do. It's not the nice thing to do. It's not the motherly, maternal thing to do. But you wrestle that person to the ground. Maybe you smack them around a few times, and you give them some harsh words. And you say, look, this life isn't about you. It's not about your individual happiness. It's not about you, like, looking at the world and saying everything is fine. Your life is about helping other people, and you have a duty to help other people. You have a duty to treat others the way that they should be treated. I don't care if you love yourself. I don't care if you like yourself. But you're here on the earth, and you have an opportunity to make things better for other people. And you committing suicide is not helping anyone else in the slightest. You've got a brain. You've got a body. You can do something today. I don't know what it is. I don't know your potentialities. I don't know your capabilities. You can do something today to help somebody else. But if you kill yourself, you're no good to anyone. Right? So if you're at that point, you recognize the world is an ugly place. Congratulations. You have the least original thought ever thought of, because people for thousands and thousands of years have been stating the same thing over and over again, that we're living in a very ugly world. We're living in a very ugly place. And they looked at human ideals and they compared them to the world as it was, and they said there's a complete mismatch here. Like, the world as it should be and the world as it is, they're complete opposites. Rather than killing themselves, they recognized this, and they tried to work on themselves to achieve some kind of inner harmony, and they spread those ideas. And that's really fundamentally what religion is an attempt to do, whether we're talking about Buddhism, whether we're talking about Christianity. And there are even aspects of this in Judaism and Islam, although Judaism and Islam, from my perspective, are much more focused on the world historical. Judaism is much more focused on the specific nation of Israel and that nation's success or failure. Islam is much more concerned with the conquest of the globe by Muslims rather than the improvement of any individual Muslim. And this is why you see these Muslim terrorists going to strip clubs, doing all these very sinful things, and then blowing themselves up because they think the one compensates for the other, which in my mind is a very perverse morality, a very perverse idea. Of course, those suicidal terrorists are part of Saudi Arabia's created concept of, I'm trying to think of the name, it starts with an S. It's not Sunni Islam, but it's the more extreme version. The Salafists. The Salafists of Saudi Arabia have come up with this extreme version, this exoteric, fundamentalist, iconoclastic version of Islam, where you can do things like that. You can sin one day, blow yourself up the next day, and still go to heaven with the 72 virgins. You know, more sophisticated, refined versions of Islam, more spiritual forms, Sufi Islam, are going to have a better perspective, from my opinion. And the same thing can be said of Judaism, where you have a Judaism that is very hateful of other people around the world, and then you have a Judaism that might be more Kabbalistic, might be more spiritual, might be more esoteric, that isn't so malicious, right? So, you have different currents and different histories. I mean, these religions came about within certain contexts, certain historical contexts. But if you look back at their origins, you can see there's legitimate ideas in there. Try to find the good in everything, because it's valuable. I mean, I'm not sure what else to say. I think that's a good stopping point. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.